At the dusty train station in Milbrook, a pregnant widow sits alone on a wooden bench, her belongings scattered around her feet. Sarah Mae Henderson had traveled 300 miles to marry a man she'd never met, only to be turned away the moment he saw her condition. The townspeople whisper and point, their cruel laughter echoing across the platform as another train pulls away without her. With no money for a return ticket and nowhere to go, she faces the harsh reality of being stranded in a town that sees her as nothing more than damaged goods. Then a weathered cowboy in worn boots approaches. Tom Brennan has been watching. From the shadows, his own troubles weighing heavy on his shoulders. His ranch is failing, his cattle dying, and he's got nothing left but his name and his word. But something about the woman's quiet dignity speaks to him. What happens when two broken souls find exactly what they need in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth whole. Sarah Mae Henderson shifted uncomfortably on the hard wooden bench, her hand instinctively moving to protect the life growing within her. 6 months along now, she could feel the baby's restless movements, as if even the unborn child sensed the uncertainty of their situation. Her fingers traced the simple gold band on her finger, the only remnant of her brief but cherished marriage. To James, they'd had barely 3 months together before he marched off with the Union Army, promising to return home to Ohio after the war. That promise had died with him at Gettysburg, leaving Sarah Mae with nothing but memories and the child he'd never see. The letters from Montana had arrived like answered prayers during those dark months of widowhood. Harold Wickham had seemed kind enough in his correspondence, a widower himself seeking companionship on his small homestead outside Milbrook. His words had painted pictures of mountain sunrises and fertile valleys, of a quiet life far from the battlefields that had claimed so many. What he hadn't mentioned was his expectation of a slender, childless bride. "I ain't running a charity house for loose women," had been his parting words before storming away from the station, leaving Sarah Mae with her trunk, her carpet bag, and the crushing weight of complete abandonment. The other passengers had long since departed with their families or into hired carriages. The station master, a thin man with suspicious eyes, kept checking his pocket watch and glancing her way with growing irritation. Sarah Mae knew she couldn't sit here much longer without causing more of a scene than she already had. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She'd eaten nothing since dawn, saving her last few coins for whatever emergency might arise. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd traveled across half the country only to find herself more destitute than when she'd started. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the cowboy who'd been lingering near the freight office. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh sun. His clothes were clean but worn, his boots scuffed from honest work. Unlike the other men who'd stared and whispered, this one's gaze held something different, not judgment, but a quiet understanding that made her pulse quicken with unexpected hope. Thomas Brennan had indeed been watching, though he'd tried not to make it obvious. At 32, he'd seen enough of life's cruelties to recognize them when they played out before him. The scene at the station had unfolded exactly as he'd expected, the moment Harold Wickham started bragging at Murphy's saloon about his mail-order bride coming in on the afternoon train. Tom had known Harold for the better part of a decade, knew him to be a man of small character and smaller heart. The way Harold had described his intended bride, emphasizing her desperation and his own generous offer of marriage, had left a sour taste in Tom's mouth. He'd come to the station partly from curiosity and partly from a nagging sense that someone ought to witness whatever cruelty Harold was planning to inflict. He hadn't expected the woman to be so young, so obviously carrying a child, or so quietly dignified in the face of public humiliation. Something about the way she held herself straight back despite her exhaustion, protective of her unborn child, despite her own vulnerability, reminded him of his own mother during the hardest years of his childhood. The Brennan homestead sat 15 miles northwest of Milbrook, carved out of wilderness by Tom's grandfather and expanded by his father into a respectable cattle operation. Both men were buried now in the small cemetery behind the house, victims of the influenza that had swept through the territory 3 winters ago. Tom had been left to run the ranch alone, watching helplessly as drought and cattle disease whittled away at his herd and his prospects. The bank held the mortgage, and payments were coming due with increasing frequency. Tom's credit at the general store was stretched thin, and he'd already sold off everything of value except his breeding stock and the land itself. Pride had kept him from seeking help from neighbors, and that same pride now warred with an unexpected impulse toward charity. But looking at the pregnant woman abandoned at the station, Tom realized this wasn't about charity at all. It was about recognition, seeing in her situation an echo of his own desperate circumstances, and perhaps an opportunity for both of them to find something better than mere survival. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Sarah Mae knew she'd have to make a decision soon. The station would close, and she'd be left sitting in the dark with nowhere to go. Her hands smoothed over her swollen belly, feeling the baby's gentle kicks as if in response to her anxiety. She thought of her sister back in Ohio who'd warned against this journey. Margaret had called it foolishness, trusting her future to a stranger's promises, but staying in Ohio would have meant accepting charity from relatives who barely tolerated her presence, or worse, ending up in the county poorhouse with her child. Marked as illegitimate despite the wedding ring she wore. At least here, in this vast territory where few people knew her story, she might have found a chance at respectability. Harold Wickham's rejection had destroyed that hope, but Sarah Mae had survived worse disappointments. She'd buried a husband and carried his child through months of grief and mourning sickness. She wouldn't give up now, not when the baby deserved better than surrender. Her fingers found the small leather purse tucked into her carpet bag. Inside were $17.32, her entire fortune. Enough perhaps for a room at the boarding house for a few nights while she figured out her next move. She'd worked as a seamstress before her marriage. Surely a town this size needed someone with her skills. The cowboy was walking toward her now, his hat in his hands, and an expression on his face that suggested he was wrestling with some internal debate. Sarah Mae watched him approach with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. In her experience, men who looked at pregnant women with anything other than medical or familial interest usually harbored intentions she preferred not to contemplate. But as Tom Brennan drew closer, Sarah Mae noticed the kindness in his deep brown eyes, the respectful way he held himself, the obvious care he'd taken to clean up before approaching her. This wasn't a man looking to take advantage of her vulnerability. This was someone who understood what it meant to face the world alone. Tom stopped a respectful distance away, his hat clutched against his chest like a shield. His tarnished pocket watch, his father's watch, though it had stopped keeping time years ago, pressed against his ribs as a reminder of family responsibility and the weight of carrying on a name that meant something in this territory. "Mum," he said, his voice low and steady, "I couldn't help but notice your situation. I wonder if I might have a word with you about a possible solution to both our problems." Sarah Mae looked up at the tall cowboy, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. His face was honest, weathered by years of outdoor work, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting across vast distances rather than duplicity. Still, after Harold Wickham's brutal rejection, she found herself hesitant to trust any man's apparent kindness. "I'm not sure what kind of solution you might have in mind, Mr." she said carefully, her voice carrying the refined accent of an educated Ohio woman, despite her current circumstances. "Brennan. Thomas Brennan, though most folks call me Tom." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to propose. "I've got a ranch about 15 miles from here, and I find myself in need of a wife, about as much as you find yourself in need of a husband." Sarah Mae's eyebrows rose. "That's quite direct, Mr. Brennan." "Yes, ma'am, I suppose it is. But I figure we're both past the point where dancing around the truth serves anybody." Tom glanced around the nearly empty station platform. "You came here looking for a husband and a home for your child. I need a wife to help me keep my ranch from going. And seems like we might be able to help each other." The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, causing Sarah Mae to wince and place both hands on her belly. Tom noticed the movement, and something softened in his expression. "When's the child due?" he asked gently. 3 months. "Perhaps a bit less." Sarah Mae studied his face for any sign of the disgust or rejection she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, she found only quiet concern. "That doesn't trouble you?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, his calloused fingers working the brim of his hat. "My mother was with child when she married my father. Not his child, mind you. My older brother James was born 5 months after their wedding. My father never treated James any different than he treated me. A child needs a father, and a man who'd turn away from that responsibility isn't much of a man in my book." The mention of his brother's name sent an odd shiver through Sarah Mae, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was simply the unexpected kindness in Tom's voice when he spoke of family, or the way his eyes grew soft with memory. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Brennan?" "Marriage. Today, if you're willing. Nothing more than a legal arrangement to start with. Separate rooms, separate lives in most ways. But you'd have a roof over your head, food on your table, and a name for your child. In return, I'd have help with the house, the cooking, maybe some advice on how to make the ranch profitable again." Sarah Mae felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. It wasn't the romantic proposal every young woman dreamed of, but it was honest, practical, and infinitely better than the alternatives. Facing her, "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I could be a terrible cook or lazy or have any number of unpleasant habits." A small smile tugged at the corner of Tom's mouth. "Could be, but I watched you sit here for the last 3 hours with dignity and grace while folks whispered and pointed. That tells me something about your character. The rest we can figure out as we go." The station master emerged from his office, checking his pocket watch with obvious irritation. "Train's not coming back through until Thursday, ma'am. You'll need to make other arrangements." Tom stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Sarah Mae and the station master. "The lady won't be needing the train, Murphy. She's staying in Milbrook." Murphy's eyes widened with surprise and more than a little gossip-hungry interest. "That's so. Harold changed his mind, did he?" "No," Tom said firmly. "Harold's loss is my gain. Mrs." He looked down at Sarah Mae with raised eyebrows. "Henderson," she supplied, her heart hammering as she realized what she was about to agree to. "Mrs. Sarah Mae Henderson. Mrs. Henderson has agreed to be my wife." Tom's voice carried clearly across the platform, and Sarah Mae saw several townspeople who'd been pretending not to listen suddenly turn their full attention to the unfolding drama. "Well, I'll be," Murphy muttered. "Tom Brennan getting married. Never thought I'd see the day." Tom extended his hand to Sarah Mae. "What do you say? Shall we go see Preacher Williams before he closes up the church for the evening?" Sarah Mae looked at his outstretched hand, strong, honest, calloused from hard work. She thought of her sister's warnings, of the child growing within her who deserved a chance at a decent life, of the long, uncertain road that stretched ahead if she refused this offer. She placed her hand in his. "Yes, Mr. Brennan, I believe. I will." The walk to the small white church at the end of Main Street felt both eternal and far too brief. Tom carried her trunk without complaint, while Sarah Mae clutched her carpet bag and tried to process the magnitude of what she was about to do. Marry a complete stranger. Trust her future and her child's future to a man she'd known for less than an hour. But as they walked, Tom pointed out various buildings and landmarks, his voice calm and reassuring. "That's Murphy's store there. He carries most everything you might need, though his prices are a bit dear. The doc's office is above the barber shop. Mrs. Peterson runs the boarding house, and she's known for her apple pies. The schoolhouse is new. They finished it just last spring. It was a small town, but it felt alive in a way that the cramped neighborhoods of Ohio never had. Wide streets, big sky, and the sense that a person could breathe freely here if they had the courage to try. Preacher Williams was indeed preparing to lock up the church when they arrived. He was a thin man with kind eyes and graying hair, and his surprise at seeing Tom Brennan with a pregnant woman in tow was evident. "Tom, what brings you to town today?" "I need you to perform a marriage ceremony, preacher. This is Mrs. Henderson, and she's agreed to be my wife." Preacher Williams's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Today, right now, if you're willing. I know it's sudden, but circumstances don't always allow for long engagements." The preacher looked between Tom and Sarah Mae, his expression thoughtful. He'd known Tom since the young man was born, had baptized him and buried his parents. He'd also watched Tom struggle alone on that ranch for 3 years, growing more isolated and grim with each passing season. "Are you both certain about this?" he asked gently. "Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into lightly." Sarah Mae found her voice. "We understand the seriousness of what we're doing, Preacher Williams. Sometimes God provides solutions in unexpected ways." The old minister smiled at that. "Indeed he does, child. Indeed he does. Well then, let me fetch Mrs. Williams to serve as witness, and we'll get you two properly married." 20 minutes later, Sarah Mae Henderson became Sarah Mae Brennan in a simple ceremony with hastily written vows and 2 witnesses who barely knew either party. The marriage certificate, carefully penned by Preacher Williams in his neat handwriting, transformed 2 desperate strangers into husband and wife with a few scratches of ink, as Tom slipped a simple band of braided grass around her finger as a temporary wedding ring. Sarah Mae felt the strangest sense that her life was finally beginning again, rather than simply continuing to endure. The wagon ride to Tom's ranch took just over an hour, winding through rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and wild grass that had turned golden in the late summer heat. Sarah Mae sat beside her new husband, acutely aware of the space between them on the wooden seat and the careful way he avoided looking at her too directly. The setting sun painted the landscape in warm hues, and despite her exhaustion and uncertainty, she found herself appreciating the wild beauty of this territory. "It's peaceful here," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled. "Between them can be lonely too," Tom replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Nearest neighbor is the Kowalski place, about 4 miles south. Good people, though Stefan doesn't speak much English yet. They came over from Poland about 2 years back." The ranch house appeared as they crested a small hill, and Sarah Mae felt her heart sink a little at the sight. It was larger than she'd expected, but clearly showing signs of neglect. Peeling paint on the shutters, a sagging front step, weeds growing up around the foundation. The barn was in better condition, which told her something about Tom's priorities and the practical necessities of ranch life. "I know it's not much to look at right now," Tom said, noticing her expression. "I've been spending most of my time trying to keep the cattle alive. Haven't had much energy left for fixing up the house." "It has good bones," Sarah Mae said diplomatically, though privately she was already making mental lists of everything that needed attention. "A little work will make a big difference." Tom helped her down from the wagon with careful hands, mindful of her condition. As her feet touched the ground, she swayed slightly, the long day and emotional upheaval finally catching up with her. His hand immediately steadied her elbow. "You need to get some food in you and some rest," he said. "When's the last time you ate?" "This morning, I think. Time got away from me today." She smiled ruefully. "I suppose marrying a stranger will do that to a person." Tom's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. "Come on then. Let's see what I can rustle up for supper." The inside of the house was clean but Spartan, furnished with handmade pieces that showed quality craftsmanship but little in the way of comfort or decoration. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. The kitchen was well equipped, but clearly the domain of a man who cooked only for survival rather than pleasure. "I'll put your things in the spare room," Tom said, lifting her trunk easily. "It's not large, but it has a good window and stays warm in winter." Sarah Mae followed him down a short hallway, past what was obviously his bedroom, to a smaller room that had clearly been unused for some time. It contained a narrow bed, a simple dresser, and a straight-backed chair. The window looked out toward the mountains, and late afternoon light streamed across the bare wooden floor. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. After the uncertainty of the morning, having any room to call her own felt like luxury. Tom set her trunk at the foot of the bed and stepped back awkwardly. "I'll let you get settled. Supper in about an hour." Left alone, Sarah Mae sat heavily on the bed and allowed herself a moment to process what had happened. This morning, she'd been Sarah Mae Henderson, abandoned and desperate. Tonight, she was Sarah Mae Brennan, married to a man she barely knew, but who had shown her more kindness in one afternoon than Harold Wickham had managed in months of correspondence. She opened her carpet bag and withdrew her most precious possession, a small wooden recipe box that had belonged to her mother and grandmother before her. Inside were dozens of handwritten cards containing family recipes passed down through generations. If she was going to make this arrangement work, she'd need to prove her worth quickly, and good food was as reliable a path to a man's approval as any. The baby shifted restlessly, and Sarah Mae rubbed her belly soothingly. "We're going to be all right," she whispered. "This is a good man, I think. He'll give us a chance to prove ourselves." When she emerged from her room, she found Tom in the kitchen, looking helplessly at a piece of salt pork and a bag of beans. The sight of this capable rancher defeated by the prospect of cooking dinner struck her as endearing rather than pathetic. "May I?" she asked, moving toward the stove. "You don't have to cook," Tom said quickly. "You're tired and you shouldn't be on your feet all evening." "Mr. Brennan, Tom, I'm pregnant, not an invalid. And I suspect you've been living on salt pork and beans for longer than is good for any man." She surveyed the pantry with a practiced eye. "Do you have any vegetables? Onions? Flour? There's a root cellar out back. Onions, some potatoes that are still good. Flour's in the bin there." He paused. "I should probably tell you, my credit at the store is pretty well used up. We'll need to be careful with supplies until I can sell some cattle." Sarah Mae nodded, filing away this information about their financial situation. "Then we'll make do with what we have and make it taste like plenty." For the next hour, Tom watched in fascination as his new wife transformed simple ingredients into something that actually smelled like food. She moved efficiently, despite her condition, and he noticed she had a habit of humming softly while she worked. The kitchen, which had felt cold and functional for the past 3 years, suddenly seemed warm and alive. "You learned to cook from your mother?" he asked, sitting at the kitchen table where he could watch without being underfoot. "My mother and grandmother both. Grandmother always said a woman who could cook well would never want for a place in the world." Sarah Mae smiled at the memory. She grew up during hard times, when wasting food was practically a sin. "I learned to make a little go a long way. That's a useful skill out here." Tom hesitated, then asked, "What was your husband like? Your first husband, I mean." Sarah Mae's hands stilled for a moment on the wooden spoon she was using to stir the gravy. "James was gentle, kind. He made me laugh even when times were difficult. He had big dreams about the life we'd build together after the war." Her voice grew soft with memory. "He used to talk about going west, finding good land where we could raise children and cattle. He'd have liked this country, I think." Tom felt an unexpected stab of something, jealousy perhaps, or simply the recognition that he could never compete with the memory of a man who died young and perfect in his wife's mind. But there was also something else, a strange sense of familiarity when she spoke of her late husband's dreams. "He sounds like a good man," he said finally. "He was." Sarah Mae resumed her stirring. "But he's gone, and we're here. I believe in making the best of what life gives us." When they sat down to eat, Tom took his first bite of the best meal he'd had in 3 years and realized that marrying Sarah Mae Henderson might have been the smartest thing he'd ever done. The first week of marriage fell into a rhythm that surprised both Tom and Sarah Mae with its naturalness. She rose early, despite her condition, to prepare breakfast and pack Tom a lunch for his long days working with the cattle. He, in turn, made sure the wood box was always full and took over the heavier household chores without being asked. Sarah Mae had been right about her cooking skills, transforming simple ingredients into satisfying meals, but Tom was discovering she had other talents as well. She'd mended 3 of his shirts that he'd thought beyond repair, reorganized the pantry so efficiently that he could actually find things, and somehow made the house feel more like a home than it had since his parents died. It was on the 8th, morning of their marriage, that the real troubles began to show themselves. Tom came in from checking the cattle, looking grim, his worn leather work gloves clenched in his fists. Sarah Mae looked up from the bread she was kneading and immediately recognized the expression of a man carrying bad news. "How many this time?" she asked quietly. 3 more overnight. That makes 11 this month." Tom slumped into his chair at the kitchen table and ran his hands through his hair. "If this keeps up, I won't have enough breeding stock left to build the herd back up next spring." Sarah Mae wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and poured him a cup of coffee. She'd learned that Tom thought better with something warm in his hands. "What does Dr. Morrison think is causing it?" "Doc Morrison treats people, not cattle. I've been managing on my own, trying remedies the old-timers suggested, but nothing seems to work." Tom's voice carried the weight of months of frustration. "My father would have known what to do. He had a feel for cattle that I never inherited." "You're not your father," Sarah Mae said gently, settling carefully into the chair across from him. "But that doesn't mean you can't learn what you need to know. Have you spoken to other ranchers? Someone must have dealt with this before." Tom's pride bristled slightly. "I don't like admitting to the neighbors that I can't handle my own problems. And I didn't like standing on that train platform with nowhere to go," Sarah Mae replied with quiet firmness. "But sometimes swallowing our pride is the only way to survive. Your cattle are dying, Tom. Your ranch is failing. Those are facts, not failures of character." Before Tom could respond, they heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Through the kitchen window, they could see a rider coming up the road, a man in a black suit and bowler hat that marked him as someone from town rather than a working rancher. Tom rose with a sinking feeling in his stomach. "That's Jameson from the bank." Herbert Jameson was a thin, officious man who took visible pleasure in other people's financial difficulties. He dismounted with theatrical flourish and straightened his coat before approaching the house. Tom met him at the front door, not inviting him inside. "Brennan," Jameson said with false joviality. "Heard you got yourself married. Congratulations." "What do you want, Jameson?" "Now. Is that any way to greet your banker? I came out to discuss your mortgage payments. You're 3 months behind now, and the bank is getting concerned." Sarah Mae appeared in the doorway behind Tom, and Jameson's eyes immediately moved to her swollen belly with unconcealed disapproval. "Mrs. Brennan, I presume? My, taking on additional responsibilities when you're already struggling financially. That seems optimistic." Tom's jaw tightened. "My wife and my finances are none of your concern beyond the mortgage agreement." "Oh, but they are, my dear fellow. The bank takes a dim view of borrowers who make poor decisions. Adding dependents when you can barely meet your current obligations suggests questionable judgment." "Get to the point," Tom said coldly. Jameson smiled unpleasantly. "The point is that you need to bring your account current within 30 days, or the bank will be forced to begin foreclosure proceedings. That would be unfortunate for everyone involved." After Jameson left, trailing smug satisfaction behind him like cologne, Tom and Sarah Mae sat in the kitchen in heavy silence. The weight of their situation pressed down like a physical force. "How much do you owe?" Sarah Mae asked finally. Tom was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. $800, he said at last. Plus interest. Sarah Mae's breath caught. It was more money than most people saw in 2 years. "And how much do you have?" "Maybe $50 if I sold everything I could spare." Tom's voice was flat with defeat. "It's not enough. Even if every cow I have left survives until spring, I couldn't make that much selling them." Sarah Mae rose carefully and went to her carpetbag in the bedroom. When she returned, she was carrying a small silk pouch that clinked softly as she set it on the table. "What's that?" Tom asked. "My grandmother's jewelry, my mother's silver thimble, a few other pieces that might have value." She opened the pouch to reveal a modest collection of items that were clearly precious to her. "I was saving them for the baby, but no." Tom's voice was sharp. "I won't take your family heirlooms to pay my debts." "They're not just mine anymore," Sarah Mae said with gentle logic. "We're married, Tom. Your debts are my debts, and my assets are your assets. That's how marriage works, even marriages like ours." Tom stared at the jewelry scattered on his kitchen table, pieces that represented generations of family history, offered up by a woman who'd known him for barely a week. The gesture hit him harder than any declaration of love could have. "Sarah Mae, I didn't come west to watch everything fall apart again," she said firmly. "I've already lost one home, one future. I won't lose another without a fight." Tom picked up a delicate gold locket, studying the intricate engraving. "This won't be enough to pay off the mortgage. Then we'll find other ways, but we'll start with this." Sarah Mae covered his hand with hers. "Together, Tom. We face this together." That evening, as Tom sat on the front porch watching the sunset, paint the mountains purple and gold, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A week ago, he'd been a confirmed bachelor facing financial ruin alone. Tonight, he had a wife who was willing to sacrifice her most precious possessions for a ranch and a man she barely knew. The baby chose that moment to kick hard enough that Sarah Mae gasped and pressed her hand to her side. Tom was beside her. In an instant, his protective instincts surprising them both. "Are you all right?" "Just an active child," she said with a smile. "I think he approves of the excitement." Just a feeling I have." Sarah Mae looked out at the vast landscape that was slowly becoming home. "James used to say he wanted a son to carry on the family name. I suppose this baby will have to carry on both our names now." Tom felt that strange flicker of familiarity again at the mention of her late husband. There was something about the way she spoke of James that tugged at memories he couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a dream after waking. 2 weeks into their marriage, Sarah Mae had settled into a routine that brought unexpected contentment to the small ranch house. Her mornings began before dawn, when she would sit by the window with scraps of fabric spread across her lap, carefully piecing together a quilt for the baby that grew more active with each passing day. The quilt represented more than just practical preparation. Each stitch was an act of faith in their future, a declaration that this child would have a warm, loving home, despite the uncertain circumstances of its arrival. Tom had grown accustomed to waking to the soft sounds of Sarah Mae moving about the kitchen, the gentle humming that seemed to be her constant companion, and the rich aroma of coffee that was somehow better than anything he'd managed to brew in 3 years of bachelorhood. He'd also grown accustomed to the way she looked in the morning light, her dark hair pinned back neatly, her face serene with the quiet satisfaction of creating order from chaos. What he hadn't grown accustomed to was the protective surge that hit him every time he thought about losing her. It was a Thursday morning when Margaret Calloway arrived, stepping down from an elegant carriage that looked as out of place in rural Montana as she did herself. Tom was in the barn when he heard the unfamiliar sound of wheels on gravel, and his heart sank as he recognized the woman who emerged from the vehicle like a vision from his past. Margaret had been beautiful at 22 when Tom had courted her in Denver, and at 28 she was stunning in a way that spoke of expensive dresses, regular meals, and a life free from the harsh realities of ranch living. Her traveling costume was immaculate despite the long journey, her gloves spotless, her hat adorned with feathers that probably cost more than Tom made in a month. Sarah Mae appeared on the front porch, drawn by the sound of visitors, and Tom watched with growing dread as the two women took each other's measure. The contrast was stark and unmistakable. Margaret sleek and sophisticated, Sarah Mae obviously pregnant and wearing a simple house dress that had seen better days. "Thomas!" Margaret called, her voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education and social privilege. "Aren't you going to greet an old friend?" Tom emerged from the barn with obvious reluctance, his hat in his hands and his jaw set in lines that Sarah Mae was learning to recognize as discomfort. "Margaret, this is unexpected." "I should think so. I had to learn of your marriage from a business associate who happened to pass through Milbrook." Margaret's eyes swept over the ranch house with barely concealed disdain before settling on Sarah Mae. "And this must be your bride. How charming." The word charming carried enough acid to etch glass, and Sarah Mae felt the familiar burn of being judged and found wanting. But she was no longer the desperate woman who'd been abandoned at the train station. She was Mrs. Thomas Brennan now, and this was her home. Sarah Mae stepped forward with as much dignity as her condition allowed. "Mrs. Calloway," Margaret corrected with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "though I was Miss Peterson when Thomas and I were engaged." The words hit Sarah Mae like a physical blow, but she managed to keep her expression neutral. "I see. Would you care to come in for coffee, Mrs. Calloway? It's a long journey from wherever you've come from." "Denver," Margaret replied, sweeping toward the house as if she owned it. "And yes, coffee would be lovely. I'm quite curious to see what Thomas has done with the old place." Tom caught Sarah Mae's arm gently as Margaret passed them. "Sarah Mae, I should have told you." "It's all right," she said quietly, though her voice was tight with strain. "We all have histories." But as they settled in the parlor, Margaret examining every piece of furniture with the calculating eye of someone appraising an estate sale, it became clear that Margaret's visit was about more than renewing old acquaintances. "I was so sorry to hear about your parents, Thomas," Margaret said, accepting a cup of coffee with the air of someone doing Sarah Mae a favor by drinking it. "And about the difficulties with the ranch. Business has been quite good for father's mining interests. We've expanded into 3 new territories." Tom's discomfort was palpable. "I'm glad to hear your family is prospering." "Oh, more than prospering. Father's been looking for investment opportunities, actually. Cattle ranching, specifically." Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. "He sent me to see if you might be interested in selling. We'd pay a fair price, certainly more than you'd get from the bank when they foreclose." Sarah Mae's hand instinctively moved to her belly, protecting the child within from this elegant threat to their security. "The ranch isn't for sale," she said firmly. Margaret's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and cold. "Oh, my dear, I don't think you quite understand the situation. Thomas owes more money than this ranch could possibly earn in the next 5 years. The bank will foreclose within the month, and then you'll have nothing. At least if he sells to father, he'll walk away with enough to start over somewhere else." "Somewhere else?" Sarah Mae looked between Margaret and Tom, seeing the careful way he avoided her eyes. "Well, naturally. A man in Thomas's position needs to be practical about his prospects. There are opportunities in Denver for someone with his background. Father could arrange a position with one of the mining companies. Good steady wages, a house in town, much more suitable for a man with a family to support." The subtext was, "Clear as mountain spring water." Margaret wasn't just offering to buy the ranch. She was offering Tom a way back to the life he'd left behind, back to civilization, back to her. All he had to do was abandon everything his family had built and accept that he wasn't strong enough to make it on his own. "That's very generous," Tom said carefully, "but I'm not interested in selling." This land has been in my family for 30 years. Sentiment is a luxury you can't afford, Margaret replied briskly. You're being foolish, Thomas. Stubborn pride won't feed your wife and child when winter comes. Sarah Mae watched Tom's face. Throughout this exchange, seeing the war between his pride and his practical fears playing out in the tension around his eyes, she realized with growing alarm that part of him was actually considering Margaret's offer. The thought of losing this place, their place, and watching Tom return to the sophisticated world where he'd once belonged made her feel physically sick. I think, Sarah Mae said, rising carefully from her chair, that such an important decision requires careful consideration. Perhaps Mrs. Calloway would like to stay for dinner. I'm sure you have much to discuss. Margaret's eyes glittered with triumph. How thoughtful. Yes, I believe I will stay. It will give us time to work out all the details. As Sarah Mae retreated to the kitchen to prepare a meal she wasn't sure she could stomach, she felt the baby's restless movements and wondered if she was about to lose the second chance at happiness she dared to believe in. Dinner was a tense affair that stretched like taffy, each course punctuated by Margaret's pointed observations about the house, the furnishings, and the obvious signs of financial strain. Sarah Mae had prepared her best meal, roast chicken, with herbs from her small garden, fresh bread, and apple preserves made from the wild fruit she'd found growing behind the barn. But Margaret picked at the food with the delicate distaste of someone accustomed to restaurant dining and professional cooks. "This is quite rustic," Margaret commented, examining a fork that bore the honest scratches of daily use. "I suppose. When one is used to making do with simple things, it has a certain charm." Tom's knuckles went white around his coffee cup, but he said nothing. Sarah Mae recognized the signs of a man caught between loyalty and temptation, and her heart ached for the confusion she could see in his eyes. "It's an honest meal made with honest ingredients," Sarah Mae replied evenly. "I find there's satisfaction in that kind of simplicity." "Oh, I'm sure there is," Margaret agreed with a smile that suggested she found such satisfaction pitiable. "Though I confess, after years of dining at the Brown Palace Hotel, one does develop more sophisticated tastes." The Brown Palace, Sarah Mae had heard of it. Denver's grandest hotel where wealthy mining families and cattle barons entertained visiting dignitaries. It was a world as far removed from this kitchen table as the moon from the earth. After dinner, Margaret insisted on taking a tour of the ranch buildings, ostensibly to assess their condition for her father's potential investment. Tom led the way with obvious reluctance while Sarah Mae followed, her back aching and her ankles swollen from the day's stress. "The barn is sound," Margaret noted, making mental calculations, though it would need expansion for a proper cattle operation. The corrals could be rebuilt, and that eyesore of a chicken coop would have to go entirely. She spoke as if the ranch were already hers, as if Tom's agreement was a foregone conclusion. Sarah Mae watched Tom's face as Margaret catalogued improvements that would erase every trace of his family's 30-year legacy, replacing it with something more efficient, more profitable, more modern. "Your grandfather built that chicken coop," Sarah Mae said quietly to Tom. "You told me he was proud of how it kept the birds safe from coyotes all these years." Tom's jaw tightened. "It served us well." "Sentiment again," Margaret said with a dismissive wave. "Father's architects could design something much more efficient." They were walking back toward the house when Sarah Mae stumbled, her foot catching on an uneven board in the porch steps. Tom was beside her instantly, his arm around her waist to steady her, his face tight with concern. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, just tired." But as she spoke, Sarah Mae felt a sharp cramp across her belly that made her gasp and double over slightly. Margaret watched this display with cool detachment. "Perhaps you should rest, Mrs. Brennan. These rustic conditions can't be easy on a woman in your condition." The casual cruelty of the comment hit its mark perfectly. Sarah Mae straightened with effort, one hand pressed protectively to her belly. "Thank you for your concern." "Not at all. I'm simply observing that a pregnant Woman needs proper medical care, comfortable surroundings, adequate nutrition. All things that might be challenging to provide under current circumstances. Tom's protective instincts flared at the barely veiled threat. My wife has everything she needs. Does she? Margaret's voice carried genuine curiosity, as if she were discussing the weather. The nearest doctor is, 15 miles away? And in winter, when the roads are impassable? What happens if there are complications with the birth? What happens if the child needs specialized care? These were fears that had kept Sarah Mae awake at night, worries she'd tried to push aside by focusing on daily tasks and the comfort of Tom's steady presence. But hearing them spoken aloud by someone who clearly saw them as weapons rather than concerns made her feel exposed and vulnerable. We'll manage, Tom said tightly. Of course you will. You're a capable man, Thomas. But capable doesn't guarantee outcomes when it comes to childbirth. Margaret's tone became almost gentle, which somehow made her words more cutting. In Denver, Mrs. Brennan would have access to the best physicians, the finest hospital facilities. The child would have every advantage. That night, after Margaret had retired to the guest room with expressions of gratitude for their hospitality, Tom and Sarah Mae sat on the front porch in uncomfortable silence. The August night was warm and clear, with a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Under other circumstances, it would have been peaceful. She's not wrong about the medical care, Tom said finally. Sarah Mae's heart clenched. Is that what you're thinking about? Selling to her father? Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark shapes of his cattle grazing in the moonlight. I'm thinking about what's best for you and the baby. If something happened during the birth, if there were complications. Women have been having babies in remote places for thousands of years, Sarah Mae said, though her voice lacked conviction. Not my baby, not my wife. The possessive words slipped out before Tom could stop them, and they both felt the weight of what he'd revealed. Sarah Mae reached for the family Bible that sat on the small table beside her chair, Tom's grandfather's. Bible with its careful records of births, deaths, and marriages written in fading ink on the family pages. She'd been reading it each evening, finding comfort in the continuity it represented, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. Your grandfather delivered your father right here on this ranch, she said, opening to the family records. 19 years old, working alone while his wife was in labor for 14 hours. She lived to be 73 and bore him 4 more children. Tom looked at the faded handwriting, his great-grandfather's careful notation of his son's birth. Times were different then. People were different then. Stronger, maybe, more willing to fight for what mattered. Sarah Mae closed the Bible gently. I'm not afraid of hard work, Tom. I'm not afraid of this place, or the isolation, or even the risks, but I am afraid of running away just because someone offers us an easier path. Inside the house, they could hear Margaret moving about in the guest room, settling in for the night as if she belonged there. The sound felt like an intrusion, a reminder that their private world had been invaded by forces that neither of them had invited, but both of them had to face. She's beautiful, Sarah Mae said softly. Yes, and sophisticated, wealthy, everything I'm not. Tom turned to look at her, seeing the vulnerability she was trying to hide. Sarah Mae, I know what I am, Tom. I know what I look like right now. How I must seem to someone like her. I just need to know, is that the life you want, the life you gave up? Tom studied his wife's face in the moonlight, seeing the quiet strength that had carried her through widowhood and abandonment, the gentle hands that had brought order and warmth to his house, the steady presence that had become as essential to him as breathing. No, he said finally, it's not. Margaret left the next morning with promises to return within a week for Tom's final answer about selling the ranch. Her departure brought relief, but also the heavy knowledge that their peaceful interlude was ending. The issues she'd raised about Money, medical care, and Sarah Mae's fitness for ranch life hung in the air like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. For 3 days, Tom and Sarah Mae moved around each other carefully, both aware that fundamental decisions loomed, but neither quite ready to voice their fears. Tom threw himself into ranch work with renewed intensity, as if physical labor could solve problems that required other kinds of strength. Sarah Mae continued her daily routines, but found herself constantly aware of the isolation Margaret had, emphasized the long distance to town, the risks that seemed more real now that someone had spoken them aloud. It was on the 4th morning after Margaret's departure that everything changed. Sarah Mae woke before dawn, with contractions that stole her breath and sent alarm racing through her body. Too early, she thought frantically. The baby wasn't due for another 6 weeks. She lay still for several minutes, hoping the pains would subside, but they only grew stronger and more regular. By the time she managed to wake Tom, she was gripping the headboard of her bed and fighting not to cry out with each wave of pain. Tom took one look at her pale, sweating face and knew they were in serious trouble. "How long?" he asked, already pulling on his boots. "About an hour," Sarah Mae managed through gritted teeth. "Tom, it's too early. Something's wrong." Tom's mind raced through their options, all of them bad. 15 miles to town in a wagon over rough roads with Sarah Mae in active labor. No guarantee the doctor would be available even if they made it. And if the baby was coming this early, "I'm going to harness the wagon," he said, trying to project calm confidence he didn't feel. "We'll get you to Doc Morrison." But as he turned to leave, Sarah Mae cried out and doubled over as the strongest contraction yet gripped her. When it passed, she looked up at him with stark fear in her eyes. "I don't think there's time." Tom had helped deliver calves and foals, but a human baby, his wife's baby, was entirely different territory. Still, he'd learned long ago that panic was a luxury working ranchers couldn't afford. "All right," he said, moving back to her bedside. "Then we do this here. Women have been having babies for thousands of years, remember? Just like you said." For the next several hours, Tom discovered reserves of patience and tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. He boiled water, found clean sheets, and did his best to remember everything his mother had ever told him about childbirth. Sarah Mae bore the pain with remarkable courage, though he could see the fear in her eyes each time the contractions peaked. It was during one of the worst moments, when Sarah Mae was delirious with fever and pain, that she began calling out to her late husband. "James," she whispered, her hand reaching towards something only she could see. "James, help me, please, help me." Tom felt his heart clench with an emotion he couldn't quite name, part jealousy, part sorrow, part something else entirely. He took her hand, trying to anchor her to the present. "I'm here, Sarah Mae, you're not alone." But in her delirium, she continued to speak to the ghost of her first husband. "James, I did what you said. I came west. I found your brother just like you told me to. But I'm scared, James. I'm so scared." Tom's blood turned to ice in his veins. "What did you say?" Sarah Mae's eyes focused on him with difficulty, fever bright and unfocused. James Brennan, my husband. He used to talk about his little brother Tom all the time. He said if anything happened to him, who should find you. He said you'd take care of us." The world tilted on its axis. James Brennan. His brother James, who'd left for the war 6 years ago and never come home. James, who'd been presumed dead when his unit was reported missing after a battle in Pennsylvania. James, whose loss had been one more grief layered onto the deaths of their parents. "James is your husband." Tom's voice came out as barely a whisper. Through her pain and fever, Sarah Mae nodded. He talked about the ranch, about Montana, about his brother Tom, who was going to build something great out here. "He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd come find you." He said, "Family takes care of family." Tom stared at his wife, his brother's wife, as the pieces fell into place with stunning clarity. The way she'd spoken of her husband's dreams of going west, Her late husband's name, which she'd mentioned, but he'd been too distracted to really hear. The strange sense of familiarity he'd felt when she talked about James's dreams and ambitions. She hadn't been a random mail-order bride, abandoned by a stranger. She was James's widow, following his instructions to find the brother he'd loved and worried about. Tom realized with overwhelming emotion that his marriage to Sarah Mae wasn't coincidence. It was James's final gift to both of them. Another contraction gripped Sarah Mae stronger than any before, and Tom pushed his shock aside to focus on the immediate crisis. Whatever revelations were reshaping his understanding of their situation, his wife and child needed him now. "Push, Sarah Mae," he encouraged, seeing the baby's head crowning. "He's almost here," with a final, heroic effort that seemed to draw on strength from somewhere beyond herself. Sarah Mae delivered her son into Tom's waiting hands. The baby was small but breathing, his cries filling the room with the sound of life triumphant over fear. Tom found himself holding his brother's child, a boy who had James's dark hair and the unmistakable Brennan jaw. Even at only minutes old, the baby looked up at him with dark eyes that seemed impossibly wise, and Tom felt his heart expand to encompass this new reality. "Is he all right?" Sarah Mae asked weakly. "He's perfect," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "Small, but perfect." As he placed the baby in Sarah Mae's arms, Tom watched her face transform with exhausted joy and fierce protectiveness. This child was James's legacy, but he was also the future that Tom and Sarah Mae would build together. "What should we name him?" Sarah Mae asked, looking down at her son with wonder. Tom thought of his brother, of the promises made, and the love that had brought this moment into being. What did James want to call him? He said if it was a boy, he wanted to name him after his father, William James Brennan. Sarah Mae looked up at Tom with tears in her eyes. "But this is your son now too. You should have a say." Tom reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand, marveling at the strength of the small fingers that immediately gripped his. "William James Brennan sounds perfect." As the morning sun streamed through the bedroom window, illuminating the small family that had been forged through pain and revelation, Tom understood that everything he'd thought he knew about his life had just changed forever. Sarah Mae wasn't just his wife. She was his brother's widow, sent to him by James's love and foresight. The baby wasn't just his responsibility. He was family in the truest sense, a bridge between the past Tom had lost and the future he was only now beginning to imagine. Looking down at Sarah Mae as she cradled their son, Tom realized that somewhere in the space between duty and choice, between honoring the dead and embracing the living, he had found something he'd never expected to find again, a family of his own. The days following little William's birth passed, in a haze of sleepless nights and overwhelming emotions. Tom found himself caught between wonder at the tiny life that had entered their world and the earth-shaking revelation that had rewritten everything he thought he understood about his marriage to Sarah Mae. She recovered from the birth with remarkable resilience, but Tom could see the worry in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. The secret she'd carried, that she was James's widow, following his instructions to find his brother, now lay between them like a bridge they weren't sure how to cross. Were they married because they'd chosen each other, or because James had orchestrated their union from beyond the grave? It was while Sarah Mae was resting and Tom was walking the floor with a fussy baby that he found the letter. He'd been looking through Sarah Mae's carpet bag for clean swaddling clothes when his fingers brushed against a hidden pocket sewn into the lining. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and addressed in handwriting that made Tom's breath catch in his throat. His own name, written in James's familiar scrawl. With trembling hands, Tom opened the letter his brother had written but never sent. "My dear brother Tom, if you are reading this, then Sarah Mae has found you as I asked her to, and I'm no longer among the living. I pray that both of you will forgive me for the presumption of what I'm about to ask. You may wonder why I never wrote to you directly during the war, why I let you and our parents believe I might be dead. The truth is that I was wounded badly at Antietam and spent months recovering in a military hospital. During that time, I met and married the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Sarah Mae Henderson possessed such strength, such grace, such capacity for love that I knew immediately I wanted to spend my life with her. But even as we began to build our life together, I could feel the shadow of mortality hanging over me. Call it premonition or simply the realistic assessment of a soldier who had seen too much death. But I became convinced that I would not survive this war. That conviction led me to make plans that I pray you will understand and forgive. I told Sarah Mae everything about you, Tom, about our childhood on the ranch, about the dreams we shared for expanding the cattle operation, about your skill with horses and your stubborn pride that would never let you ask for help when you needed it. I painted such a picture of my little brother that she felt she knew you before she ever met you. More than that, I made her promise that if anything happened to me, she would go west and find you. Not as a burden to be foisted upon you, but as family looking after family. You see, Tom, I knew even then that Sarah Mae was carrying my child, and I could not bear the thought of my son growing up without knowing the Brennan name, the Brennan land, the Brennan legacy that our grandfather and father built. But I also knew that you had been alone too long, carrying the weight of the ranch and our parents' deaths without anyone to share the burden. I hoped that perhaps in caring for my widow and child, you might find the family you'd never had the chance to build for yourself. I am not asking you to love Sarah Mae because I loved her, though I think it would be impossible for any good man not to love her given time. I'm asking you to see in her what I saw, a woman of extraordinary courage and grace who deserves a chance at happiness, and a partner worthy of the life our family has built in Montana. If I'm wrong, if this presumption is too great, or if your paths lead in different directions, then I trust you to help Sarah Mae find her own way in the world. But if I am right, if you find in each other what I suspect you will, then consider this letter my blessing on whatever life you choose to build together. The child she carries is a Brennan, Tom. But more than that, Sarah Mae herself has earned the right to be part of our family through her strength, her love, and her willingness to follow a dead man's instructions across half a continent in search of people she's never met. Take care of them, brother. But more than that, let them take care of you. Your loving brother, James P.S. There is something else Sarah Mae doesn't know. Our grandfather's pocket watch, the one that stopped working when Pa died, is hidden behind the loose board in the barn, where we used to hide as children. I always meant for it to go to you, but there never seemed to be a right time. Perhaps it will keep better time for you than it did for me. Tom read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. James hadn't just sent Sarah Mae to him as a last resort. He'd orchestrated their meeting with the careful deliberation of a man who understood both their hearts better than they understood themselves. Looking down at the baby sleeping in his arms, Tom saw not just his nephew, but the future James had envisioned. A Brennan son growing up on Brennan land, carrying forward the legacy that meant everything to their family. But more than that, he saw the bridge between his old life and his new one, between the brother he'd lost and the family he'd found. That evening, as Sarah Mae fed the baby and Tom sat across from her at the kitchen table, he placed James's letter in front of her without a word. She read it with tears streaming down her face, one hand on the baby and the other pressed to her heart. When she finished, she looked up at Tom with a mixture of love and anguish that nearly broke his heart. He planned all of this, she whispered. From the very beginning, he planned for us to find each other. Are you angry? Tom asked. Sarah Mae was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the lines of James's handwriting. I should be. I should be furious that he manipulated us both, that he never told me the truth about what he was asking me to do. She looked up at Tom with eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had learned to find grace in unexpected places. But how can I be angry when his plan brought me to you, when it gave William a father and gave you a son? Tom reached across the table to cover her hand with his. The question is, where do we go from here? Are we together because James wanted us to be, or because we choose to be? Before Sarah Mae could answer, they heard the sound of horses approaching the house. Through the window, Tom could see Margaret Calloway's elegant carriage, accompanied by two other riders, men in dark suits who looked like lawyers or bankers. "She's back," Sarah Mae said, instinctively drawing the baby closer to her chest. Tom rose from the table, his jaw set in determined lines. "Yes, she is, and it's time to give her our final answer." Margaret swept into the house without waiting for an invitation, her eyes taking in the domestic scene with barely concealed triumph. Behind her came Herbert Jameson from the bank and a thin man with calculating eyes who was introduced as Margaret's father's attorney. "Thomas," Margaret said with false warmth, "I hope you've had time to consider our offer seriously. I've brought Mr. Davidson here to draw up the papers immediately if you're ready to proceed." She glanced at Sarah Mae, who was sitting at the table with the baby, and her expression shifted to something like pity. "Oh my, the baby came early, didn't it? How unfortunate. I do hope there won't be lasting complications from such a premature birth." Tom stepped protectively between Margaret and his family. "William is perfectly healthy, thank you for asking." "William?" Margaret's eyebrows rose. "An interesting choice. Rather old-fashioned, don't you think?" "It's a family name," Tom said firmly. "William James Brennan, after his grandfather and his father." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Tom was claiming the baby publicly, establishing his paternal rights and responsibilities before witnesses who would carry the news throughout the territory. Jameson cleared his throat impatiently. "Mr. Brennan, we're here on business. The bank requires an answer today about your mortgage payments. Either you settle your account immediately or we begin foreclosure proceedings tomorrow." Tom looked at the men arrayed before him, Margaret with her promises of easy wealth and comfortable exile, Jameson with his threats and deadlines, Davidson with his legal papers that would sign away everything his family had built. Then he looked at Sarah Mae, holding their son and watching him with quiet faith that he would make the right choice. In that moment, Tom understood that this wasn't just about money or land or even family legacy. This was about who he chose to be, a man who ran from difficulty toward comfort, or a man who stood and fought for what mattered most. He walked to the kitchen shelf where Sarah Mae kept his grandfather's Bible and removed a wooden ring he'd been carving in secret during the long evenings while she recovered from William's birth. It was simple work, but polished smooth and carved with both their initials intertwined. "Margaret," he said, turning back to face the group with the ring in his palm, "I appreciate your father's generous offer, but this ranch isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "Thomas, you're being foolish. Think about your wife and child. Think about what's practical." "I am thinking about them," Tom replied. "I'm thinking about the life we're going to build here together and the legacy we're going to leave for our son." He walked to Sarah Mae's chair and knelt beside her, holding out the wooden ring he'd carved. "Sarah Mae Brennan, I know we started this marriage as a practical arrangement. I know we came together because of circumstances and maybe because of James's planning. But I want you to know that I choose you now. Not because my brother asked me to take care of you, but because I love you, because I want to build a life with you that's ours, not anyone else's." Sarah Mae's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the ring. With trembling fingers, she removed James's gold band and set it gently on the table before extending her hand to Tom. "I choose you too," she whispered as he slipped the wooden ring onto her finger. "I choose this life, this place, this family we're making together." The declaration sent shockwaves through the room. Margaret's face went white with fury, while Jameson sputtered about deadlines and legal obligations. But Tom only had eyes for his wife and son, for the family that had been forged through loss and love, and the wisdom of a brother who had understood what they needed before they knew it themselves. The battle for their future was about to begin, but Tom knew with absolute certainty that they would face it together. Margaret's composure shattered like fine crystal dropped on stone. The calculated elegance that had defined her every movement since arriving in Montana gave way to raw fury as she watched Tom slip the wooden ring onto Sarah Mae's finger. "You absolute fool," she hissed, her cultured voice turning sharp as a blade. "You're throwing away everything, your future, your security, your chance at a real life. For what? For this?" Her gesture encompassed Sarah Mae, the baby, the modest ranch house with its honest ware and simple furnishings. Tom rose slowly, placing himself between Margaret and his family. For love, Margaret. For family. For things that matter more than money or social position. Love? Margaret's laugh was brittle and bitter. "You call this love? This arrangement born of desperation and circumstances? You barely know this woman, Thomas. She came here as someone else's mail-order bride, pregnant with another man's child. She's using you, just as she tried to use Harold Wickham." "That's enough," Tom said, his voice carrying a warning that made even Jameson step back slightly. But Margaret was beyond caution, beyond the careful manipulation that had served her so well. "You think she cares about you. She's grateful to you. Nothing more. Grateful for shelter and respectability and a name for her bastard child. The moment something better comes along, Sarah Mae interrupted, rising from her chair with William cradled against her chest. "I'll still be right here, because I've already found the best thing in my life." Her voice was steady, but Tom could see the hurt in her eyes at Margaret's cruel words. He also saw something else, a strength that reminded him of his mother, a quiet dignity that no amount of elegant breeding could match. Margaret turned her venom towards Sarah Mae with renewed force. "How touching. Tell me, Mrs. Brennan, what exactly do you bring to this marriage besides your obvious condition? Can you help him pay the mortgage? Can you save his cattle? Can you give him entree into society beyond this provincial backwater?" "I can give him what you never could," Sarah Mae replied with quiet conviction. "A partner who chooses to stay when things get difficult, instead of running toward easier options." The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Margaret's face flushed red, then went pale as she realized that her own abandonment of Tom years earlier had just been thrown back at her. Jameson, sensing that the personal drama was derailing his business, cleared his throat loudly. "This is all very entertaining, but we have legal matters to resolve. Mr. Brennan, your mortgage payment is due in full today. If you cannot produce $800 by sundown, the bank will begin foreclosure proceedings tomorrow morning." Tom felt the weight of that impossible sum pressing down on him like a physical force. $800, more money than most people in the territory saw in 2 years. The sale of Sarah Mae's jewelry might bring $50, perhaps $60. If they were lucky, even if he sold every remaining head of cattle, he'd fall far short of the amount needed. "How much time do I have?" Tom asked. Jameson consulted his pocket watch with theatrical precision. 4 hours until sundown. I suggest you start gathering anything of value you might wish to liquidate." Margaret stepped forward, her composure returning as she sensed victory within reach. "Or you could simply accept Father's offer, sign the papers, take the money, and walk away with enough to start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere with better opportunities for a man with a family to support." The lawyer Davidson produced a sheaf of legal documents from his leather satchel. "The sale agreement is quite generous, Mr. Brennan. $1,500 for the land, buildings, and remaining livestock, more than enough to settle your debts and provide capital for a new beginning." Tom stared at the papers that would erase 30 years of his family's work, that would turn the Brennan Ranch into a footnote in someone else's business ledger. He thought of his grandfather clearing this land by hand, of his father building The barn, through 3 summers of back-breaking labor, of the cemetery behind the house, where both men lay buried. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Time is the one thing you don't have," Jameson replied smugly. "The bank has been more than patient. Today, you pay in full or you lose everything." As if summoned by the mention of losing everything, the sound of approaching horses reached them from outside. Tom looked through the window to see a group of riders coming up the road, neighbors he recognized despite the distance. Stefan Kowalski was in the lead, his weathered face set in determined lines. Behind him rode the Peterson family from the boarding house, old Murphy from the general store, Preacher Williams, and at least a dozen other residents of Milbrook and the surrounding ranches. "What's this?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with sudden uncertainty. Tom stepped onto the front porch as the group dismounted, their faces reflecting a mixture of resolve and something that looked like righteous anger. Stefan approached first, his English still heavily accented but clear in its intent. "We hear banker man comes to take your ranch," he said without preamble. "This is not right thing. You are good neighbor, good man. We come to help." Preacher Williams stepped forward, holding a worn leather pouch that clinked softly as he moved. "Tom, the congregation took up a collection after we heard about your troubles. It's not much, but it's given with love and respect for your families. Name." Mrs. Peterson, the boarding house proprietor, produced a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "My silver tea service. It belonged to my grandmother, but she'd have wanted it used to help a neighbor in need." One by one, the neighbors stepped forward with offerings. Some money, some valuables, all given freely to a man who had never asked for their help, but had earned their respect through years of honest dealing and hard work. Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion as he realized what was happening. These people, many of whom he barely knew beyond nodding acquaintance, had come together to save his ranch, not because they owed him anything, but because they understood what it meant to lose the land that defined you. Margaret watched this display of community solidarity with growing alarm, while Jameson's confidence began to waver as he calculated the potential value of the items being donated. "This is touching," Margaret said with forced calm, "but surely you don't expect charity to solve your problems permanently. What happens next month or next year when you face the same difficulties?" Tom looked at the faces surrounding him, honest. Weathered faces marked by hard work and simple faith in the value of helping one's neighbors. Then he looked at Sarah Mae, standing in the doorway with their son, her eyes bright with tears at this unexpected show of support. "Next month," Tom said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled group, "we'll face whatever comes together, as a community, as neighbors, as family." The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains as Tom and Stefan Kowalski spread the donated items across the kitchen table, calculating their combined value. The sight was both humbling and inspiring. Mrs. Peterson's silver tea service, old Murphy's grandfather's pocket watch, the Kowalski family's wedding rings, and dozens of other precious items that represented lifetimes of saving and sacrifice. Jameson watched the proceedings with growing nervousness, his earlier confidence evaporating as the pile of valuables grew. Davidson, the lawyer, kept checking his own pocket watch and glancing at Margaret with barely concealed concern. "Well?" Margaret demanded as Tom and Stefan finished their calculations. "How much?" Tom looked up from the ledger where he'd been tallying figures, his face carefully neutral. $738 if we can get fair market value for everything. The number hung in the air like a death sentence, $62 short. So close to salvation, yet still falling short of the bank's demands. Jameson's relief was palpable. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brennan, but the bank requires payment in full. $738 is not $800. "Wait," Sarah Mae said from the doorway where she'd been standing with William. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned carrying a small wooden box that Tom had never seen before. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it to reveal a collection of documents and what appeared to be stock certificates. "I didn't tell you about these because I wasn't sure they were worth anything," she said, placing the papers on the table. "They're shares in my father's shipping company back in Ohio. He left them to me when he died, but I've never known what to do with them." Davidson's demeanor changed instantly as he examined the certificates, his practiced eye recognizing their potential value. "These are shares in Henderson Maritime," he said, unable to hide his surprise. "They're quite valuable. The company has exclusive contracts with several major railroads." Tom stared at the documents that could save their ranch, then looked at his wife with amazement. "Sarah Mae, these could be worth thousands of dollars. Why didn't you mention them before?" "Because I didn't come here to buy my way into your life," she said simply. "I came because James told me you were family, and family helps family. These shares represent my father's world, my old life. I wanted to know that you'd choose me for myself, not for what I could bring to the marriage." Margaret's face had gone ashen as she realized that Sarah Mae, the woman she'd dismissed as a desperate, penniless widow, might actually possess more wealth than anyone in the room had imagined. Davidson examined the certificates more closely, making quick calculations. Based on current market values, these shares are worth approximately $1,200, more than enough to settle your debt and provide working capital for ranch improvements. The silence that followed was deafening. Tom looked from the certificates to Sarah Mae's face, seeing not triumph, but quiet resolution. She was offering him not just financial salvation, but a choice. Accept her wealth and the security it represented, or forge their own path through struggle and sacrifice. "I can't take these," Tom said finally. "They're your inheritance, your security." "Our security," Sarah Mae corrected gently. "Just like the ranch is our ranch, and William is our son. We're a family now, Tom. We face everything together." Jameson stepped forward eagerly, sensing the resolution of his problem. "If you'll just sign the transfer documents." "No," Tom said firmly, pushing the certificates back towards Sarah Mae. We keep these as our emergency fund, our insurance against future troubles, but we pay the mortgage debt with what our neighbors contributed." He turned to face the room full of people who had come to help him, seeing confusion and concern on their faces. "I know it's not enough money to satisfy the bank's demands, but I have a proposal that might work for everyone." Tom reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, the deed to his ranch, which he'd been carrying since Jameson's first visit. With deliberate ceremony, he spread it on the table next to the donations and the stock certificates. "Jameson," Tom said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had finally understood his own power, "I'm offering you a choice. Accept $738 as payment in full, or explain to your bank president why you rejected a profitable settlement in favor of a costly foreclosure process that might take years to complete." He gestured toward Sarah. "Mae and the certificates. You see, my wife's assets make her a very attractive banking customer. I suspect there are other financial institutions in the territory that would be eager to earn her business. Institutions that might also be interested in purchasing distressed ranch properties from failed banks." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. If Jameson forced a foreclosure, Sarah Mae could simply use her wealth to outbid the bank at the resulting auction, or even to establish a competing bank that could undercut their business throughout the region. Jameson's face went through several color changes as he processed the implications of Tom's proposal. Margaret watched with growing horror as she realized that her carefully orchestrated victory was slipping away. "This is ridiculous," Margaret protested. "You can't seriously consider accepting partial payment as settlement of a legal debt." "Actually," Davidson said quietly, his loyalty clearly shifting toward the side with the most money, "debt restructuring is a common banking practice, especially when the alternative might result in significant losses for the institution." Tom looked around the room, at his neighbors who had sacrificed for him, at his wife holding their son, at the certificates that represented financial security beyond his wildest dreams. Then he looked at the deed to his ranch, the piece of paper that meant more to him than any amount of money. "What's it going to be, Jameson?" Tom asked. "Do we have a deal?" Jameson's hand trembled slightly as he signed the debt settlement papers, his pen scratching across the legal documents that would forever change the balance of power in their small corner of Montana territory. The banker's defeat was complete, his earlier arrogance replaced by the bitter recognition that he had underestimated both Tom Brennan's resolve and Sarah Mae's hidden resources. Margaret stood frozen in the middle of the room, watching her carefully laid plans crumble like old parchment. The woman she'd dismissed as a desperate charity case had just revealed herself to be wealthier than most of the mining families in Denver. The man she'd expected to come crawling back to her had instead chosen love over comfort, struggle over security. "This isn't over," Margaret said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "You think you've won something here, but you're still the same stubborn fool who drove me away 6 years ago, still choosing the hard path when easier options are available." Tom looked at her with something that might have been pity. "You're right about one thing, Margaret. I am the same man. I still believe that some things are worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for. I still think that what you build with your own hands means more than what you inherit or manipulate others into giving you." He moved to stand beside Sarah Mae, their shoulders touching in unconscious solidarity. "The difference is that now I have someone who shares those beliefs, someone who chooses to fight beside me instead of trying to convince me to surrender." Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. "You'll regret this, Thomas. When the next crisis comes, and it will come, when the cattle die or the crops fail or that baby gets sick and needs medical care you can't afford, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember that you had a chance for a different life and threw it away for this, for love," Sarah Mae said quietly, shifting William to one arm so she could take Tom's hand. "For family, for the kind of life worth living." Margaret swept from the house without another word, her entourage of lawyers and bankers trailing behind her like the remnants of a defeated army. Through the window, they watched her elegant carriage disappear down the road toward town, carrying with it the last remnants of Tom's old life and old temptations. The neighbors began to disperse as the sun set behind the mountains, each family taking with them the quiet satisfaction of having helped preserve something important. Stefan Kowalski was the last to leave, gripping Tom's hand with calloused fingers that spoke of shared understanding between working men. "You are a good neighbor," Stefan said in his careful English. "We help because we know you help us when time comes. This is how community works, yes?" "Yes," Tom agreed, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. "This is exactly how it works." Alone at last, Tom and Sarah Mae sat on their front porch as darkness settled over the ranch. William slept peacefully in Sarah Mae's arms, his tiny face serene in the lamplight that spilled through the windows. The August night was warm and filled with the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and crickets singing in the grass. "Do you regret it?" Sarah Mae asked softly, turning down Margaret's offer. "You could have had an easier life." Tom considered the question seriously, looking out at the land his grandfather had claimed and his father had improved. Tomorrow there would be cattle to tend, fences to mend, hay to cut before winter. There would be lean times and hard choices, moments of doubt and seasons of struggle. But there would also be mornings like this one, with his wife beside him and his son in her arms, watching the sun rise over mountains that stretched to the horizon. "I don't want an easier life," he said finally. "I want this life, with you, with William, building something that will last." Sarah Mae leaned against his shoulder, and Tom marveled at how perfectly she fit there, as if she'd been made to fill the empty spaces in his world. "James would be proud of us," she said. "Proud of what we've built from the pieces he left behind." "We built this," Tom corrected gently. "You and I, with our own choices and our own love. James brought us together, but what we've become, That's ours. 6 months later, on a crisp spring morning that painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, a traveling photographer arrived at the Brennan ranch to capture the image that would hang above their mantelpiece for the rest of their lives. In the photograph, Tom stands behind Sarah Mae's chair, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. She holds William, now a robust baby with bright eyes and his father's stubborn chin, while her other hand rests on her belly where their second child grows. The photographer had wanted to take the picture inside, using the formal parlor as a backdrop, but Sarah Mae had insisted on the front porch. Behind them, visible in the carefully composed frame, stretched the rolling hills and distant mountains that define their world. It's a photograph that speaks of permanence and belonging, of people who have found their place and intend to stay. But the most striking thing about the image, the detail that visitors would comment on for years to come, is the expression on both their faces. Tom's weathered features show the quiet contentment of a man who has found his purpose, while Sarah Mae's gentle smile reflects the serene confidence of a woman who knows she is exactly where she belongs. The new family portrait sits in place of honor on the mantelpiece, replacing the old daguerreotype of Tom's parents that had occupied that spot for so many years. It represents not just the present moment, but the future they're building together, a future rooted in the lessons of the past, but growing toward possibilities they're only beginning to imagine. On warm evenings, Tom and Sarah Mae still sit on that same front porch, watching their children play in the yard, while the sun sets behind the mountains. William has grown into a boy who shows every sign of inheriting his father's love for the land and his mother's quick mind for business. His younger sister, Elizabeth, toddles after him with the fearless determination that seems to run in the Brennan blood. The ranch prospers now, built on the solid foundation of community support and wise management of Sarah Mae's business investments. But more than financial success, the Brennan family has found something that no amount of money could purchase: the deep satisfaction of a life built on love, sustained by commitment, and enriched by the knowledge that some of life's greatest gifts come disguised as unexpected challenges. In the end, Tom and Sarah Mae discovered what James had somehow known from the beginning, that the best marriages aren't built on convenience or desperation, but on the radical choice to keep choosing each other day after day, season after season, year after year. They are proof that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin not with passion, but with two broken souls who dare to believe that together they might be whole.